Previously on the Seventh Valkyrie, the Edaran forces strike into the heart of the old city, escalating tensions between both sides of the river to a fever pitch. What awaits for Meridia, whose feud with Jossun is precluded only by her duties as a member of the Light Corps? Find out next on the Seventh Valkyrie. Chapter 25. Under Watch of the Wolf. The 18th day of winter. Dawn. Meridia. Meridia laid awake in bed that morning, staring up at her ceiling as she waited for the first rays of winter sun to brighten her room. It had been a long time since she had been in bed for sunrise. Far enough back that she couldn't remember if it had been years or decades. Sleeping in on late sleep mornings was missed training, reading, studying, hunting, or active recovery, and she had needed every ounce of each to keep up with the rigors of life as a member of the Light Corps. And before that, she needed the extra time to keep up with the rigors of life as the leading member of the Mandarian military police force. And before that as a cadet, and before that, well, maybe she had gotten a late sleep before the war had started. Physically, Meridia may have even needed to sleep at that point, but with her eyes closed or eyes open, there was no way that sleep would come, not after last night. The events still ran over and over and over in her head, and she thought back to how it all had began. After another day in the dank, dim office by the side of the river, Meridia had made a show of exasperation and made her way back home. She'd trained and then set out for the docks, grabbing a crassa for the salty lass, just like always. It was important to keep up appearances for the men tailing her. She'd spot them dipping in and out of sight now and then as she made her way through the city, and it was a double watch on the commander's big night. But with a tail or not, there had been nothing to stop her keeping a watchful eye on the flow of men towards the riverside wharf. They were staggered, and the flow kept them in little gaggles and groups rather than in some organized rush, but it was clear that a force of some size was gathering along the river. After another crassa, just to be sure, Meridia had set back out from the salty lass, pretending to be allured by the lights shining on the other side of the river. Then the explosions had erupted from the old city, and by the time she had reached the riverside docks, the bay was alive with vessels. A quarter were making landfall across the river already. The other half were in transit, and the last quarter were bustling with soldiers, rushing down from posts in Oceanside Barracks as the call went out to sound the bells. Spotting a vessel filling up with soldiers that she recognized, Meridia had strode onto the gangplank, grabbing a heavy bow from her weapons cache along with 2 sets of arrows, and quickly taking command of the vessel. There was little trouble. Many of the men aboard were men she'd had the pleasure of training with, and in the slightly more cramped longboats, they had set out for the far shore. But there was a reason that the old city had stood unconquered even through the depths of the war, and as they approached the shoreline, the thumping, shrieking eruption of thwart powers flared out into the night. The forces of the Freelanders were emerging from the depths of their city, and the tide was turning quickly. Meridia had commanded her boat to hold their position offshore then. Edaran reinforcements were still flowing onto the land, and for a moment she hoped that she had been cautious for no reason. But then the thwarts had swept forth in their waves from the shadows, and the flames from the very earth itself, and in a matter of minutes the Edaran movement had slowed, then stopped, and in the roaring hordes of thwarts had broken the iron advance. The Edaran warfront broke and began to retreat, while the thwarts charged after them, driving rank after rank of Edarans back to their vessels or slaughtering them on the shore. Meridia had drawn her weapon and begun to fire when the first wave of thwarts crashed into the surf. She was aiming for those with the brightest glowing gifts and the ones closest to the boats. At first, half of her men had taken up arrows alongside her and tried to help, but it quickly became clear that with the swelling seas and the chaos by the shore, archers used to firing from dry land would be little help. So on a barked word from Meridia, they had piled up their quivers by her feet and taken up the oars, as Meridia continued to draw and fire, hitting more often than she missed. Breathe out to knock. Breathe in to draw. Boom! Fire. Breathe out to knock. Breathe in to draw. Boom! Finding a steady rhythm, Meridia settled into the flow of battle and fired with increasing precision until she was no longer missing a single shot. The men on shore had either been slaughtered or reached the boats to retreat, but there was no time to rest. The thwarps were surging out into the ocean on their wave riders and other vessels, striking with a cool glow as they pursued the Edaran longboats retreating across the water. Meridia was not suicidal, but she would be damned if she let anyone say she'd run away. So under her command, their boat, now with vastly improved oar power from the men who had dropped their bows, they raced along the edges of the Edaran retreat. Meridia's bow sang out again and again and again, and it sang until the last Edaran longboat had either returned to the new city or lay burned, splintered, and sinking into the sea. Only when the last Edaran boat had gotten away from the swarming Old City forces did Meridia allow her vessel to return to shore, and she was silent as she watched the flickering wave runners orbiting in the night. She had killed dozens of thwarps out on the water, but countless more Edarans lay dead. When they'd made shore, Meridia had ignored the cheers, the offers for drinks, the incredible stories already racing along the shore of the fire-haired girl who couldn't miss with a bow. Instead, she'd stopped only to meet the eyes of the High Commander, who had stood far from the shore, up on a command tower quickly erected, surrounded by his legion of clerks and officers. Their eyes met only a moment, Meridia and the commander, and Meridia quickly shed his gaze and made her way back home. If she had spoken to him then, with the heat of battle in her, she probably would have killed him. The commander's men fell back in line, watching her as she made her way back home, and as she meditated and stretched and prayed for the dead, she was pretty sure she could see them even glancing in the windows. So, she had gone up to lay in her bed and pretended to sleep. And now, Meridia shook her head and glanced back at the curtains. The sun had risen now. Normally, she would be out on her run by this point, or at least washing up, exercising, sharpening for the day, preparing for what awaited her. Meridia kicked the covers down to her feet and lay in the cool, wintry air. She'd left the window cracked the night before, and she felt goosebumps raise up along her skin where it was exposed to the breeze. All right, come on, let's get up. Meridia was no stranger to all-encompassing aches, pains, and bruises that made her body want to remain in bed. In fact, soreness and pain was like an old friend in the morning. It was familiar, consistent. But what kept Meridia laying down wasn't soreness or pain or crippling cramps or wounds that cried out not to be moved. It was just a resolute unwillingness to rise, a weight brought on by a feeling she couldn't quite put a name to. Wolf, watch over me, and help me find the strength within myself to carry on. As she finished the mantra, the cool breeze gusted through the window, and the burst of chill that she assumed he had sent was all the impetus Meridia needed to swing up out of her bed and start moving. When Meridia had exercised and stretched, washed and sharpened, and finally set out for the day, the town was alive with the news of the events of the night before. There were countless different stories being told as she walked through the streets towards command, and no small number of them included Meridia herself. The tales of her exploits that night before were already doubling in size, and they showed no signs of stopping. There was no obligation to hail the Light Corps outside of ceremony or official greetings, and there was especially none for civilians to whom the Light Corps owed their service. But walking along the street that morning, you would have thought it was the law to hail Light Corps. The shopkeepers who knew her called out a little prouder. The soldiers on the street who she had passed a dozen times before all stopped to salute, and the children who usually weren't awake peeked out from behind their mother's skirts to watch her go by. The embrace of the cool breeze as she walked made her feel the gaze of the wolf once again, a gentle reminder that she had done a good thing last night. Every Edaran life saved was a small victory, even though the road ahead was long and would throw them many other challenges. As she descended the ramp to arrive at command for the morning, it seemed that the first of those many challenges had already arrived. Ceremonial banners and flags, those of the raptor, the Edaran crest, and the wolf, flew from every window and flagpole, and the second-floor balcony had been cleared at high command. Now, at its center was a dais placed and draped in Edaran colors, and there was an honor guard already standing along every pillar of the balcony. Edaran soldiers, officers, and lots of civilians had already started to crowd the street stretching from command nearly to the base of the staircase, making the going hard as Meridia tried to weave through. The white cloak helped her make ground, but in the crowd, the well-wishers and the storytellers worked against her, because it seemed like everybody wanted their chance to talk to last night's hero. She had nearly resorted to shouting and shoving when there was a commotion up on the balcony, which turned quickly to the twin echoes of drums and the slow rise of horns. Meridia stopped where she stood. She was tall enough to see over the crowd, so her position didn't matter, but what surprised her was the exact music. That was the announcement of the High Commander, or any high official, for a formal address. As Light Corps, she would have been expected to be up there at his side. Why hadn't anyone warned her? Had she fucking over... A little jump in her stomach, like a youngest child who had left the gate open and let the hogs out, settled as Jossun stepped out onto the balcony. It was just another slight, another insult from the old man. If Chaden couldn't be by his side, then he absolutely wouldn't let Meridia be seen at his right hand. Jossun held himself with a solemn dignity, though, as he strode out to the edge of the balcony, taking in the crowd. Rather than the command regalia fitting his full station for a public address, he was wearing an outfit of deep black, brightened only by subtle silver filigree, along with the gold of his stars and the medals on his lapel. It was the type of outfit typically reserved for memorial services. The horns swelled a melancholy tone as he arrived, and he scanned the crowd with weary eyes. If he saw Meridia, and he likely did, he did not acknowledge her, instead meeting the eyes of strangers with an understanding, mournful look. Meridia saw through it all as an act. Jossun was not understanding, and he did not mourn. With a raised hand, though, Jossun set the drums and the horns to silence, took one last, lingering gaze at the faces in the crowd, and then began to speak. We gather here today in the aftermath of a great tragedy. Last night, Edaran soldiers on patrol responded to a riot across the river. But their attempts to keep peace and protect not only the innocent here, but across the river as well, were met with a violent, unprovoked attack by the ruthless criminal syndicates known only as the Four Families. It pains me. It pains me to share that over 200 honest Edaran men were lost last night, and we have still just begun to understand the damage. We expect... His voice cracked expertly. We expect that the death toll will continue to rise as we take stock of who lost their lives in last night's noble effort. The murmur among the crowd began to grow, and Meridia could see people shaking their heads, some tearing up, a few cursing under their breath. However, Jossun's booming voice cut through the crowd. Want to know what happens next? Join us on Patreon to become a hero of Edaran and get early access to episodes along with bonus features, director's commentary, and the full Tab to archive. You can also find other ways to support us at the links in the description, and we will see you next week.